All right, Jeff, thank you for taking the time to come onto the podcast today.
Yeah, always glad to talk to you. Always happy to talk about these things and always have good conversations with you.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd just like to preface as well that Jeff and I have done another episode. So if you're listening to this and it's the first time you're hearing Jeff and I speak, we're going to bypass a lot of what we spoke about last time, which was around, calorie tracking versus internal signaling and why we both kind of go for the latter now. So if you're interested in that transition, I'd say go check that episode out. Because, of course, we're going to chat a lot about that missing, messy middle ground of nuance between when is intentional fat loss actually, an okay thing to pursue.
Yeah, I think this is a hard conversation because people there's a lot of polarization at both ends of the spectrum, and um, almost nervous to talk about something like this publicly because we've had these conversations before. Sometimes the nuance gets lost in the conversation, and you have to be real careful about how you talk about it because it's very easy to offend a lot of people, and rightly so. I mean, there's reasons for that, but at the same time, I think it's important to have these kinds of conversations and not just stick to the easy stuff.
I think what I'd say at the very beginning is that we are going to talk about the data of intentional weight loss. We're going to talk about the health benefits irrespective of it, as well as respective of it, and we're going to talk about it from a science-based way, but we are in no way saying that people ever should do, or have to in order to be more respected or liked, or we're not saying that this is a do or die goal for you to, have to feel better. We're just going to talk about where it might be something that someone would want and whether that's one possible and two okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I guess the first thing,
that's
fair enough, right?
yeah. Let's see how this goes.
So I guess the first thing is covering about neither you or I have read every single study out there, but there's a figure that gets thrown around by a lot of people about, a certain percentage of diets don't work. And I guess the first thing for us to cover is where the truth of that statement lies and where there's room for a different interpretation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the typical one that people hear from the weight neutral, weight inclusive crowd, the health at every size crowd, which I definitely consider myself a part of, and I align with a lot of those principles. Definitely, is this 95% of diets fail, and that number it comes from a variety of research on the topic, but one paper in particular that found that actual number, and that was by Stunkard and back in the 50s. But they looked at only 100 people, and it was people that I think they all worked for the NIH, and so the demographic wasn't particularly broad, and I think they used the same sort of approach to weight loss. And so I think when you look at if you were to take any weight loss approach and apply it to all of the people in the study, that you're probably going to find 95% of the time that it's not going to last for most people. Mm-hmm. So if you take people and put everyone on a macro counting plan, maybe 5% of them are going to successfully see results with that. Or if you take put them on Weight Watchers or whatever diet it is. And unfortunately, that's the way that we have to do research. There has to be some kind of methodology that's in place. We can't just say, hey, take this completely sort of individualized, make adjustments on the fly, take a different approach as needed kind of a way and study that. That just doesn't work very well in research. So you need some of that structure. But unfortunately, every human being is so completely different that we really do need very different approaches, because all of these things are very complex. Body shape and size is a very complex topic. It's not just a matter of eating less and moving more, or eating too much, or eating too much processed food, those kinds of things. So it's just a very complicated issue. And so it's hard to research that.
Yeah, it is. And I like how you mentioned that about the study in particular that gets quoted, and the population size, and the findings that are then drawn from that, because we have seen as well long-term longitudinal weight loss studies, and there seem to be certain percentages that people seem to be able to maintain, but a large percentage of people putting weight back on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think with that, we also have to think about, as you said, what approach has been used, because when doing research, we're using just populations of people, and we're using approaches that need to be standardized in nature, which are usually of the fad diet or group weight loss variety, which we are all aware of have their limitations based on their methods. And you do then have to ask that question, well, would it be different than working on a case-by-case basis with individuals and having that personalization and that combination of, I like to think of it as a combination of acceptance, commitment therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and internal signaling guidance to help someone really change their relationship with food and their behaviors, as opposed to just saying, hey, go and follow this list of foods that you can and can't eat.
Yeah. Well, I think even people who, even coaches, we both know a lot of different coaches. We have close friends and other various connections throughout the industry who use intentional weight loss. And, but even with those who do take a very individualized approach to each client, it is true that most of them don't keep the weight off long term. So while I don't like to throw around the 95% number, because I don't think that number is precise, and I think it lacks nuance, like I said, I'm still comfortable saying most diets fail, whether it's 80%, 90, 95, most attempts at intentional weight loss do result in weight regain. So, and then often, as we talked about, gaining even more than what you lost, and especially depending on the approach. If it's a very restrictive approach, we know that that's going to have some downsides. And so, so I do want to make that clarifying point. And I think that's one of the dirty little secrets of the fitness industry too, is that most coaches know that people regain this stuff. And when we talk about success, is it, what do we mean by, hey, they successfully lost weight and kept it off? Is it because they did it for a year, 2 years, 5 years? And so there's a lot, again, a lot of nuance there that's often overlooked. So,
yeah, and I'd completely agree with that. I think it's a complex landscape, because as we mentioned on a previous conversation we've had, that we're both aware of people who have made certain changes to their body shape and size and maintained them, maybe not to the level that they first made them, though. So there is that sort of interesting, like,
right,
oh, I lost 50 pounds, but then actually I've put back on 20, but I'm still 30 pounds down from where I was at my, at my largest size, which is interesting. And I guess my next question would be, because we both have a lot of, what would the word be? The best word be? We have a lot of cohesion with the Health at Every Size crowd, because I honestly also believe that the data we have around health and weight is associated, and that health is a set of behaviors. But I guess talk about that a bit more, because I think that's something that's lost. The message that we just hear all the time is, if you're bigger, you're going to be more prone to all of these different health conditions and comorbidities.
Yeah. I think that's unfortunate that's again, that the dichotomous thinking. So you have the one side where the immediate go-to is that if you're having a problem with your health and you happen to be in a bigger body, immediately, oh, well, it's because of your bigger body. And so we jump there first. And I think a lot of the people in the Hayes crowd and the weight inclusive and weight neutral crowd, and the fact that they point out that a lot of times thin people get these same diseases and medical issues and struggles, I think that it's that's good to point that out, because there's thin people with diabetes, there are larger people with diabetes. And so that in and of itself says, hey, maybe we shouldn't always jump to body size as a first thing and then immediately tell everybody lose weight to fix the problem. But then at the same time, if there are associations with being in a bigger body and certain conditions, then it's certainly a factor to consider. But it's important that we look at the whole person and look at what approaches can we offer this person that we would offer to a person in a thinner body. And I think that is important too. And so that we're not always looking at the weight part, because if weight loss was easy, then it would be perfectly fine to say, hey, you know what, just go try and lose some weight. But since it's not, and since it's not maintainable, then it doesn't make sense to always push that one.
No. And I'm glad you said that about if they were the same, look at the two people as if they were the same and offer them the same answer to their health problem, because people in smaller bodies do get the same health problems that are associated with being in a larger body. So it's this almost weight-centric healthcare education system that we're pushed upon, but then they're not looking at, and we're not, that's not what this podcast is about either, is trying to conform to that stigma and phobia, because it's not at all. We're actually saying, when is it someone's right to want to try to lose fat, and is it going to be a possible goal for them to even consider? And so I'm really glad you mentioned that about the health implications of certain conditions. And okay, well, if they were smaller, what would your answer be as a doctor? And they need to be the same, because if they're not, it's unfair. And there is a really complex system of energy intake, food availability, as well as the person's genetics and how they process food and all the rest of it, which compiles that person's size.
Yeah. And I think that's a good, you said something in there that kind of made me think about a little bit of a comparison. I think it comes back to, what can the person do? What are they able to do? And within the context of their life, what do they want to do? What are their values? And what are the negatives of taking any approach? What are the consequences, the downsides? And I think that's something that's often overlooked. So when we tell someone, hey, well, if you lost some weight, this would help your fill in the blank condition. And, but for so many people, it might help their condition. Let's say somebody did lose X amount of weight and it helps their diabetes, but now their social life is a mess. Their emotional health is a mess. They're bordering on an eating disorder and these kinds of things. Now you've helped their physical health a little bit, or maybe even a lot, but now these other facets of their health are in shambles. And so that person is not healthier necessarily. I mean, their body might not, like their diabetes may be in remission, or their blood sugars may be lower and they're now more in the pre-diabetes range. But now they're suffering from depression and anxiety, or their depression and anxiety that they had before is now elevated. So there's that. I think that's one of the things that gets overlooked in this conversation. I think we've talked a little bit about that too, that I think, in theory, I think sometimes a person could be in a place where the trade-offs are worth it for them, whatever trade-offs there are. Maybe intentional weight loss is something they're able to do, and they're also able to mostly maintain their social health and their emotional health. And maybe they struggle in certain areas at times, but the trade-off is okay. Kind of like when you take a medication that impacts your sex drive. It's like, okay, well, I'm taking this medication, it's helping this area, but it's tanked my libido, but it's a trade-off that I'm willing to take, the pros and the cons weigh out. And so I think that's where this conversation sometimes never goes, into that kind of messy middle where we say, well, what are the trade-offs? And Now, to be clear, I've chosen as a coach to stick to the weight neutral approach. But that doesn't mean that I don't think that messy middle exists.
No, of course. And that's obviously what this whole podcast is designed to explore, is that like middle grey area between these two sides.
Yeah.
And you've had a lot more conversations with people than I have about the potential of improving these conditions without actual fat loss happening. Because that's the thing that I remember us being taught about diabetes and heart disease and all the rest of it. It was like, well, there's an association with losing weight with these things. But is it just because they're actually eating a more, variety of foods, more nutritious foods, exercising regularly, getting better sleep and lowering their stress levels? Is that actually the play rather than the weight loss being the play, Like, are there benefits to fat loss?
I agree. I think, and there does seem to be some, and this is where I think we all have to have a real open mind and acknowledge when something doesn't align with our narrative. There are some studies that seem to show that the weight loss in and of itself may impart certain health benefits. And I've seen this in some people close to me where they didn't even, through illness, they actually lost weight, horrible way to lose weight, a large amount. But then once they got the health issue resolved, there are some things that they feel better about. Their health is actually improved, the energy levels getting around, the pain levels are down. So there are, you see this happen where blood sugars improve. So I think there's something there. But for me, but at the same time, then like what you said, there's tons of research showing that, well, when a lot of times we incorporate these health promoting behaviors, those things in and of themselves seem to have very similar effects in a lot of people. So I think that, again, it's that lack of nuance where we say, oh, well, we have research showing that when you do these health promoting behaviors, you see this improvement in your health. We also have this research that seems to show just the certain fat loss in and of itself may have benefits too. And if we're on the weight neutral side and we say, oh, well, that's bogus and throw out that stuff, I don't think that's being genuine. And I don't think that's being a good scientist. Likewise, if we're always focused on weight loss as the thing and sort of, I guess they did some health promoting things too, but it's really the weight loss. That, again, that's lacking also. And so I think it's always important to just acknowledge what we do know and then figure out how to best use that information.
Yeah, and I guess that's that middle ground between when is it a result of someone who does improved behaviors that align with having a healthy lifestyle, so getting more and better quality of sleep, managing stress in ways that don't involve don't always involve food and or alcohol, managing stress in general, just to have lower levels of stress, exercising regularly and eating more proteins, more plant-based meals, not meals, but foods, and generally having a wider variety of more nutritious foods. As a result of that, if they drop body fat, it's not because they've been targeting fat loss, it's because they're targeting those behaviors. And I guess that would be that middle line of diet culture is forcing fat loss by any means necessary because that's the main goal, and that's because otherwise you're not healthy and you're not worthy, versus I'm going to make health-based changes because I want to be a healthier person, and as a result of that, I've lost some body fat.
Yeah. And that's kind of what, as a weight neutral coach, that's kind of, I have those conversations a lot with clients because to be honest, I mean, most people do initially come for weight loss, or they come, they're ready to give up the dieting. They understand intuitive eating a little bit, and they're like, okay, I'm ready to give that up. But at the same time, they're like, I really hope that I lose some weight through this, or what can I do to maybe get some weight loss through it? And so often it's helping them understand that, hey, we're going to work on some, if we see an issue in your relationship with food,
Mm,
your sleep habits, your health behaviors, then we'll address those, and then let's just see what happens. And
mm.
you may maintain weight, may gain weight, may lose weight, but the focus is then on those health promoting behaviors. And we do know from a lot of research that those in and of themselves do seem to be quite beneficial. Like there's a recent paper, probably should have had it up here so I could make sure
No, don't
I
worry.
referenced it
Quoted it
correctly. But
right.
there's a recent
Yeah.
paper where they looked, yeah, they
Find
specifically
it and
looked
throw it to
at
me, and I'll
liver
put it in
fat.
the notes.
Yeah. But they looked at liver fat accumulation, and which is definitely a bad thing, having fat in your liver. Often people come at that, well, you need to lose weight and that will reduce liver fat. In some cases that happens, but in other cases you can actually reduce the liver fat just by increasing physical activity. And it's not 6 days a week in the gym going hardcore. It's like walking, just being more active. So if you're sedentary and you have liver fat accumulation, non-alcoholic fatty liver, that kind of thing, then getting up and moving and just being a bit more active can have profound effects on it. And so those are the kinds of things that are really cool, because then we say, I mean, maybe you'll lose weight too, I don't know, but at the same time we can set those foundations in place that will support health in general, without that focus on weight loss. Because we know when we've worked with clients in the past on intentional weight loss, that it almost always gets turned around and the focus starts, even if they're working on sleep, they still are checking the scale. Well, is the sleep thing working? If we focus on more consistent meals, well, is this working? And the way they know if it's working is if their waist is shrinking, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really glad you mentioned that paper, and please do send the link when you get it, because I'd love to reference more stuff in there, because it's so easy for us to say there are studies that show this, and then unless we provide that actual evidence, sometimes claims can be made, can't they? As we all well know. And I think it's beautiful to talk about those benefits that are irrespective of what people would say, like just lose weight, right? Actually, it's a case of no, let's make health-based changes. But funny that you mentioned that you have that conversation with clients about, oh, well, I hope I lose a little bit of weight out of this, or I would feel more comfortable being smaller or wanting to lose fat. And I think personally, because I know my own journey to where I am at now, I realize that I'm of a certain size that allows me a certain quality of life, and I have a certain relationship with my body image and with food that I've worked on to reach here. But I know that in my former self, I would have been attracted by people talking about losing weight sustainably, even if they'd then coached me in a way that I've got to this end result now, if that makes sense. And I wonder whether there's sometimes a place to say to talk about sustainable changes and even weight loss, just to stop people from falling for fad diets, restrictive plans, and crummy scenarios that are going to keep them stuck in that cycle of failure, to help them to kind of bring them in and then say, by the way, even if you're smaller, you won't necessarily be happy. We need to work on your body image. We need to work on your relationship with food. We're going to control things that are within your control, which are your action steps. And we're going to do that via unconditional permission to eat and honoring hunger and satisfaction. And you may or may not lose fat, but you'll definitely become your healthiest self. But I just don't really know how to balance that,
That's a really hard one. And I think the way that I talk about it, whenever anybody has a problem with that, with even entertaining the idea of intentional weight loss, is that it's not up to me to decide what's right for you, what you can do with your body. And I sometimes I hear people say it in such a way, well, if you want to do that, go ahead. It's almost like, if you want to ruin your life and give yourself an eating disorder, go for it. That's your body, your choice. I don't look at it that way. I look at it more, like I was saying earlier, the trade-offs. So for some people, and let's look at professional athletes, that's a good example.
Mm-hmm.
The life of a professional athlete is not the most healthy for your body. I mean, for one, they're playing hurt. They are often having to maintain a very tight weight range to meet the coach's standards, especially like combat sports are a good example. You actually have to get down to a certain weight. That's not good for you. Nobody says it is, but it's a trade-off. So what are you doing in order to get that result? And so that's an extreme example. I think, I'm making $20 million a year as an NFL player. And I think a lot of people can say, well, hey, if I've got some disordered eating practices, 20 million a year, a few disordered eating practices, I'm relatively healthy. They may make that trade-off, that kind of thing. But I think when we bring it back to individuals, the trade-off may be less dramatic. And for one person, it may be that they're going to extremes to maintain a 10-pound lower body. And it's like, that's may not be the best trade-off if there's no particular reason for it, because of the effort you have to go through to maintain that. And so that may not be a good trade-off. But on the other extreme end, what about somebody who can't go on a commercial airline? For me to tell them they should not try and lose weight, that they should just love their body as it is and learn to accept it, I think that's important. I really do. And I think that acceptance is really important part and can really help with all kinds of different facets of our health, emotional and psychological. But at the same time, discouraging them, like outrightly discouraging them from doing something that would allow them to participate in the things that I am able to participate in, I have a really hard time with that. Now, again, I don't coach that. I don't coach the intentional weight loss part, and that's kind of that messy middle. So I don't feel like I'm rambling here, but it's kind of a tough thing for me to say that, because I think some people, the whole idea of fat phobia, I think that's an important thing that we look at. Why are you trying to lose this weight, or why are you wanting to lose this weight? Are you, do you hate the way you look? Do you hate yourself? That's not going to be probably a beneficial driving factor for it. But if you're like, I don't really care how big I am, but I want to be able to do this and this, and I can't in the body that I'm in, and waiting for society to change, because there are things, some people say, well, if they would just build more accommodating things, I might be able to do these things. That's great. No, but to tell somebody you're going to have to wait 10 to 20 years for society to catch up, I don't know. So I'm kind of rambling here, but I guess my point is that I usually approach it from the perspective of, here are the pros, here are the cons. And often, I would say most cases, people say, yeah, you know what I was wanting to do really has been detrimental to my health, mentally, psychologically, socially. And so it isn't a good trade-off for me after all. I thought it would be, and it isn't. And so I'm going to try this other approach.
Makes sense. I wouldn't worry about, going around the houses on that, because I think it's good to help people with that thought process of where the line may get drawn. And as you said, it's not our job to tell people what to do with their bodies, but it's important to understand where the desire is coming from. As you said, like, acceptance is really important. And like I mentioned with my previous journey and with other clients, I often say to them, tell me about this time when you were last happy with your shape and size. And sometimes it doesn't even exist. And they talk about when they first started noticing that they were body conscious, and how it was probably teenage years and when they started getting attracted to the opposite sex, but also they can now specifically remember their parents were always trying to lose weight or always commenting on their weight, and they were always mentioning about the amount of food they were eating, and you think, okay, so is that more where this has stemmed from? And that's the conversation then about body image being the play rather than intentional fat loss. But also, you mentioned, for people who might be uncomfortable in their size, waiting for society to catch up is a much longer play. And you then have to talk to them, well, we can always give it a go. Or, well, let's work on the behaviors that are within your control, because you've also said that you want to sleep better, you want to exercise more because you're not currently active, and you want to eat different foods because you've realized that you're only eating maybe one type of food. And then the conversation changes, doesn't it, to changes that are proactive and within their control, and saying this might happen as a result of that, but we're going to keep a close eye on your relationship with yourself and food and work on that too. And I think there's definitely place for that with the small amount of reading I've done in terms of like acceptance commitment therapy, when it's co-paired with an intentional fat loss program, seems to be encouraging in their results of both the actual results and the sort of maintenance in follow-up. But the follow-up is still quite short-lived, if that makes sense. You know, we still have Project Eat and everything, which seems to be the longest study that we have in terms of following these kind of things.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because you know, even if somebody says I'm willing to accept the trade-offs, that still doesn't guarantee that it's going to work for each person. That's the frustrating thing too, is you can't just say that here are the downsides of intentionally trying to lose weight and keep it off, because those may not be the only downsides for some people. It may it still may not be an achievable thing, which is frustrating. And it's, you know, it's not to give up. It's not to take away hope from people that they could ever reach a goal that they've hoped for. And by goals, I'm not even talking about shredded Instagram model goals. I mean, I'm talking just like goals for improving the way that they're able to navigate our world that's not really set up for bigger people for the most part.
Yeah. And that's a really great point. It's an interesting one because there are people, as you said, that you and I both know who have been in larger bodies and then have made certain changes to become smaller, but depending on their methods and how long they've sustained that for, or whether there was a bit of regain and they've sustained half or a certain percentage of that, and you know, only the person can tell you how their relationship with food or what methods they used were to get to that point as well. And it's interesting, a lot of the mindset identity people who talk about this idea of, you know, really believing certain things and being able to achieve them. I sometimes think like, yeah, okay, I can get on board with that from an aspirational identity perspective. But then you've got to also remember this really complex map of pathology that we talked about earlier in terms of someone's genetics and their activity levels and the way they process and digest food, and the way they then process and process and use energy and the food available to them, and all of these other things will go into that person's shape and size. So as you said, they can try their damned hardest and it still might not happen. And then where do you go?
Yeah. Well, you know, one of the things that I think is really important is that often I think where dieting really is problematic is it just skips over things and says, okay, well, you want this goal, so let's do whatever we can to get you to this goal, instead of saying, well, what's going on in your life? What's going on with your relationship with food? Let's just look at it from a whole different perspective. You know, instead of saying, I want my body smaller and what can I do to get that to happen? And I'm willing to take whatever consequences are required to do that. It's like, well, just shifting the whole thing. Well, what's, like you've talked about earlier, what's your sleep like? What are your eating habits like? You know, I don't eat until 2:00 in the afternoon sometimes. And then when I get home from work, I can't stop eating. It's like, oh, okay, well, you know what? That could be contributing to where you are, but it may not. That may not be the issue. It could be a more of a genetic thing. But you know what? Let's see what happens if we get all of these foundations in place, and then we'll see how you feel. And so many times people get those things in place, and actually they're like, yeah, you know what? I'm actually kind of okay with the size of my body. It's not exactly where I'd want. I wouldn't have minded if I lost it, but I got moving more, and now I have the energy that I thought I had to lose weight to achieve. And
Mm.
I thought it was a digestive thing or a blood sugar control thing, an issue there. And now that I'm eating consistently and I'm eating mixed meals, it's reduced my blood sugar spikes over the course of the day, and all kinds of different health promoting behaviors that we can do. Not to mention that sometimes that can take the stress off. And so sometimes the stress in and of itself can be problematic physically. And once you relieve the stress, a lot of those or physical things can alleviate. I think a lot of us can attest to the fact where we have sleep issues because of stress. We have digestive issues because of stress. And so you may be thinking, oh, well, it's because I'm bigger or because of this or how I'm eating. And it's like, well, it's a stress thing. So now you work on those foundational principles. And that's what I like with intuitive eating. And I do want to emphasize, if anybody's listening to this thinking, oh, well, they're saying, he uses intuitive eating and they're talking about the potential for weight loss. Intuitive eating, those principles, they're not for intentional weight loss. So I do want to emphasize that they are specific principles that are in place that if you try and throw in intentional weight loss into the mix, it will interfere with developing those principles. And so that's why, as a coach, I've decided not to bring in that intentional weight loss option for my clients. If they want to pursue and work on those foundational principles, then that's what I want to work on with them. But I did want to make sure that doesn't that nobody assumes that we're saying, oh, that we're mixing intentional weight loss with intuitive eating, since that's where my focus is. I know a lot of yours is also that is a very different system.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so we're not saying intuitive eating for weight loss. We're just talking about where, is it wrong to want fat loss? Are there benefits in and of that goal itself? Right. What's the messy middle between wanting to lose fat versus wanting to just be a healthier person? What are the parallels or contraindications, and what does the data say versus our personal experience? That's all that we're saying. And interestingly, I'm going through intuitive eating workbooks and webinars, and I've just read the book. And then when I was looking at a recent book that was more about skills and frameworks and guidelines, and they were talking about, honoring your hunger and honoring your emotions without food, it was interesting where they talked about a lot of people's struggles with their relationship with food or with their habits come from eating outside of those times, and so it's interesting to have that, as you said, let's develop the framework of having no guilt around food choices. Let's develop the framework of eating based on your hunger and your appetite. Let's develop an exercise regime that you enjoy, and let's focus on eating for health and adding gentle nutrition, because that's something that's not spoken about on social media enough at all, of what that actually looks like. Versus I think it's a really interesting line between what does eating for health mean versus what's diet culture. Almost everything becomes diet culture. Like, oh no, don't focus on eating more protein, that's diet culture. And we're like, no, actually, as we get older, we don't digest protein as well, and it's been shown that strength training plus a higher protein intake reduces risks of sarcopenia and osteoporosis, which means people don't break bones when they fall over. And I think that's an interesting line between those two things.
Yeah, I like that concept of the eating skills. And if somebody is really still thinking of wanting to pursue intentional weight loss, my advice to them would be to find somebody who at least acknowledges that intentional weight loss is not for everybody. Somebody who's going to help you develop the skills. And so that's why I have a few people who I'm extremely careful to refer to. I do not just refer to anybody, but if somebody is dead set on intentional weight loss, I'd rather send them to somebody who I know is at least going to work on some of the skills. We may have a difference of opinion on how to address that. And that's fine, but to send them somewhere that somebody else will at least prevent them from another fad diet or developing an eating disorder, because they're going to be looking for those signs and symptoms. And and that kind of thing. And I think that that may be something where I differ. You know, I haven't really heard a lot of other intuitive eating counselors and coaches address that topic. You know, how to it's kind of a tricky one. You know, what do you do if somebody is dead set on it? Do you just say nope, can't work with you, or do you kind of refer them on? And so that's kind of where that messy middle comes in. It's like I'd rather that they at least get something better than the worst case scenario.
Yes, and if anything, you know, because you and I have had some conversations privately as well as on both of our different podcasts, and it's where I've been battling with a lot of my own sort of values and thought processes about these things, and had probably gone full anti-diet intuitive eating, and I'm starting to come back again more toward that skill guideline framework. What does the person want, and how can I help them achieve that in a way that's best for them, if that makes sense? Because just like I mentioned earlier, if someone came to me and they had health-based goals, but that was also one of them, I would want to help them so that they weren't drawn into working with someone that prioritized external food control, got them in an all or nothing state of mind when it comes to step counts and exercise and habits, and effectively left them worse off. Because I know for myself that I'm not against this goal, if that makes sense. And so actually I would much rather help them with that framework rather than let them go to the wolves.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's important, because I mean there's no right 100% right way of addressing our health and our relationship with food. And I think that's something that we need to all be very honest with ourselves. If we think that intuitive eating is the only way, then I think that's very problematic. So, and it's very easy to fall into that. Or keto is the only way, or carnivore is the only way, or vegan, macro counting, whatever, you know, fill in the blank. So it's very easy for us to do that because something worked for us. So I had an eating, you know, I didn't have an eating disorder, but I'm speaking for someone. I had an eating disorder, and macro counting was the driving factor that got me there. And now they have this bias that everybody who macro counts is probably going to develop an eating disorder. Even if they don't say it that way, in their mind, they're thinking their friends that they see doing that, they're like, oh my gosh, they're going to get an eating disorder like I did. And I think that we need to be really open to the fact that there are different approaches. And as a good example, there's another approach called eating competence from Ellen Satter, which is a model that's very much in alignment with Hayes and it's similar in a lot of ways to intuitive eating, but it incorporates a bit more structure. So something that intuitive eating may not encourage as much, not that intuitive eating, we don't use structure in that, but this eating competence, that's actually a little bit more of a key principle. And to say one is better or wrong would not be a good thing. You know, some people thrive with a bit more structure and other people thrive with a bit less structure, and that's okay. So I think that's one of the things we need to be acknowledged through all of this is that because of the way human nature is, I think we have to acknowledge that there are different ways and call out negatives when we see it, but also be open to the fact that, you know, the approach that this person may be using may be working for them.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. Yeah, the eating competence is definitely something I'll check out because it sounds quite similar to the eating skill and guideline and framework approach. And as you mentioned, personalities will have a big impact because some people prefer a bit more framework and guidance. And intuitive eating does provide that, I think, in a structured approach in terms of like worksheets and step by step in terms of what they really need help with. It's not a free for all of eat whatever you want all of the time, which is often the misinterpretation of that approach. But again, we chatted more about that in our first conversation. So Jeff, we're coming up on time here. Another fantastic conversation. I'm really appreciative of you giving the time, particularly because we've actually been going for half an hour longer than this due to 3 failed attempts to record this
Yeah.
episode. But where can people find more about, yourself, your approach, and the content that you put out there, which is, your podcast is great with the conversations you have with people about ways to improve certain health conditions without necessarily losing weight.
Yeah. So my podcast is Men's Intuition, and you can find that on all the podcast platforms. I'm on Instagram at intuitive.eating.men, and I post content there related to weight neutral health improvements and weight neutral eating behaviors and that kind of thing, where the focus is not on weight loss. And then also my website is hopedrivesme.com, and that's how you can find more information about any events coming up, webinars, or anything like that, and then also how to work with me. So those are the main places to find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeff. A pleasure to speak with you as always.
Thank you.